Hey everybody, welcome or welcome back to Evening Reader. My name is Priscilla. How are you doing out there? I thought I would do a reading catch up, a July reading catch up, since I didn't get to do one on the weekend. Things have continued to be kind of crazy in terms of getting to film. So it's catch as catch can. It may stay that way for another week or two, but I'm thinking that things will start to get back to normal hopefully next week or the week after. So we'll see how that goes. Um, yeah, so how's your July? Can you believe it's today that I'm filming this is July 20th, and here we are. It seems like July will be over like in a few days. And the way time goes, it's certainly, you know, yeah, that's how it feels anyway. Uh, I, for one, am always thrilled to welcome autumn because it's my favorite season, but it can feel like time is really flying. And we've been incredibly lucky. Yeah, let's talk about weather because why not, right? We've been incredibly lucky. We started off unseasonably warm. Our June was unseasonably warm and dry, and now July is we're really back to normal, while down south they're really suffering and having record high temperatures in Spain and Italy, closing a lot of tourist attractions because it's just simply too hot for people to be outside. And of course, here in the EU, it's dangerous because a lot of people don't have air conditioning. So yeah, crazy times. And of course, the United States, my parents are suffering in Texas. I know some of you are in Texas and suffering. In the South, my in-laws in Florida are getting weirdly heavy just dumped on with rain. And it's just, yeah. So I think that's probably a great lead into talking about the first book that I read, or the first book I want to talk about in this video anyway. In a way, which is Station 11, which I read, and holy crap, why did I wait so long? 9 years. 9 years I put off. Like I make it sound like I, had it on some special shelf and I wouldn't touch it until a certain date. But no, I put off reading Station 11 because it had just gotten so much hype, and I just thought it's not going to be as good as everybody says. And to be honest, I'm not really a dystopian apocalyptic novel fan overall. I know some people really like that. I just don't really tend to. So that was probably the other thing that kept me from picking it up, or from picking it up. It was on my Kindle, from from tapping the icon as I scrolled past it, going, maybe stay. No, I'm not in the mood for that kind of book. Well, okay, I was stupid. And yeah, but I'm happy I read it now. And one thing I'm so curious about, and that I was very curious about as I was reading, was if you out there were one of the people who read Station 11 before the COVID pandemic, before 2020, I would just be so interested. I wish that I could be in your shoes and understand this book, or have, what was it like to read this book? I wonder if it's not better after that. If it's there, I think that there's something to the fact that maybe now something like that feels like much more of a possibility, that it could be real. And having that feeling really, for me, I think grounded that book. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have liked it as much before. I think I still would have really enjoyed it because, I mean, she just writes beautifully Her characters are so well developed. She moves quite seamlessly through time, which I'll talk about that a little bit more. But overall, I think she made some really interesting decisions with this novel. And I think the first and most interesting decision that she made, and I read a few interviews after I finished the novel, which was that she said she didn't want to focus on the pandemic piece. She didn't want to focus on the pandemic. She didn't want to focus on the collapse or the apocalyptic feeling, but more on people who had then come to some sense of normalcy, or who were trying to, um, live a stable life, and starting also in some ways to rebuild civilization. And that choice alone makes this a standout and a really special novel, I think, in that subgenre, if you will, of novels. Because so often these apocalyptic type stories, or these sort of dystopian type stories, will focus so much on the tragedy, or um, almost the fight against the inevitable thing that seems to be happening, and people losing against it. Whereas this is very much like that happens. She skips over it. So when the book begins, it starts in what is, I think, supposed to be near present day in Toronto, and at a theater production of King Lear. And this famous actor is taking time away from films. He's kind of on a little bit of a a downslide, I guess you could say, in his film career. And he's decided to do theater, and he is from Canada, and he decides to do King Lear in Toronto. And not a spoiler, he has a heart attack and dies. This happens in the first few pages. So, and, but when he has the heart attack, there is a man in the audience, Javine, who, I have to make sure that I have his name right. I'm like, he's Javed, he's Javine, he's Javon. I'm sorry, Javon, who actually is training to be an EMT, but is a former paparazzi who once interviewed Arthur and has come to see him in King Lear, and is entranced by the play. But then when Arthur collapses, he runs up onto the stage and begins to try to help him. And there are also other people on the stage, obviously, because it's, theater production. And one of those people is a little girl who is playing sort of a ghostly version of one of the three daughters. And her name is Kirsten. And she will become important later in the story. But the first part of the book tells the story of Arthur's death, and then also follows Javon as he watches Arthur die. He stays with Kirsten until her handler comes to find her, and then he heads out into the night, and he decides to walk home. A blizzard is starting to fall, snow is falling, it starts to thicken into a blizzard, and he gets several phone calls from a friend of his who is a doctor at a major hospital. And over the course of the phone calls, learns essentially that there is this thing called the Georgia flu that is spreading rapidly, and people are dying. People just are dying very quickly. They're contracting the disease and dying within hours sometimes. So he decides to go and find his brother, go to his brother's apartment. He goes shopping, he tries to load up on supplies, and then he goes to his brother's apartment, and his brother is a paraplegic, he was a he was a reporter, and he was on assignment, and he was shot and is a paraplegic. And so Javon goes to stay with him. And that is just the first section covers that one night. And then immediately in the next section, we move forward 20 years. And Kirsten is now 28 years old, not 8 years old anymore. And she is with a group of people called the Traveling Symphony. And they are just a band of people. Some people were musicians and actors, but not necessarily. But they are now musicians and actors, even if they weren't in their past lives. And they travel the shores of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. They go up and down the shores, performing Shakespeare's plays and also performing various symphonies. So I'm not going to do an entire plot synopsis here, but Kirsten and her group of friends, her close friend Arthur, and then also her friend Dieter, and there's also Saeed, who is one of the actors and her former lover. There's the leader of the troupe, who they call the conductor, and then there are all of the musicians and the players, and they are all ages from much older than she is to much younger. I think the youngest person is 15, and she's a person who was born into this new world. There's no electricity, there's no internet, there's no anything. Basically, everything has started to go back to nature. Something like, I want to say, I'm probably going to get this wrong, like 90% of the world's population has died from this Georgia flu, or at least that's what they believe. These people who are in this region of Canada and the United States. Well, they're in the United States now, but some of them start in Toronto. So it reading through that first section, especially where Javon is learning about the pandemic, what else to call it, the Georgia flu, was something that was really sort of, just your heart's pounding, because you know something bad's going to happen. And I think you could get that probably before COVID you would have felt the same way, but now after COVID, it's like that now we can't ever release ourselves from the fear of that phone call or the fear of those news stories. I very distinctly remember being that when talk of what became COVID, or known as COVID, it was in China, and then we heard it was here in Europe, in Italy, or down south. And I remember that there was some talk about it, and I went to a concert. This was like February 20th, 21st. I went to a concert here, and then the next day I went to Paris with my husband. And at the concerts, they were saying that some of the ticket people were talking and saying, well, yeah, there's this flu going around, and so I think that everybody that they had sold tickets to, not everybody showed up. It ended up being kind of a small crowd. And yeah, the next day we went to Paris, and there was a little bit of news, but not much. But that was Thursday morning. By Saturday afternoon, when we were coming back, they were already starting to lock down Italy. And I remember seeing a headline that said that, and just thinking, what is going on? What the hell is happening? And, not even, I guess, a week and a half later, the Netherlands was closed, had closed its borders, shut everything down. You couldn't go anywhere but the grocery store and the drugstore, and that was the beginning of March, and then we stayed that way until the beginning of June. And it was very strange. And I know it was different in different places in the United States. It was some places were in lockdown for a long time, like New York City. Some places were in lockdown for a few weeks, and then everybody wanted to get back to normal and, just decided to open everything up and just go ahead and do it. Yeah, so not to talk about COVID, but there's no way now to read this book without having been through that experience. And then, to think about what they must have gone through. But as I said, so she goes forward 20 years and she spends almost no time. There's only one character she spends any time with and tells us the whole story of what happened to that character from the time of the announcement to the present day. And that is Clark, who was an old friend of Arthur's. That they met in Toronto. All of the characters are enmeshed, interestingly connected in different ways, all through Arthur. Weirdly enough, they're all connected through Arthur. But the book then follows on one strand. It follows Kirsten and her group, the Traveling Symphony, as they travel through Michigan, and they go to a town called St. Deborah on the Water. And there they find, they're expecting to find some former members of the symphony who they were going to pick up and take with them. And they find that those people have fled that town, and that town has been taken over by a man who calls himself the Prophet. And nothing really happens. They go through, they do their performance, everything is fine. But they are sort of warned away. And so they pack up and leave very quickly. And they're on the road, and they're on their way, and it turns out that they have a stowaway. So they are expecting that there's going to be some kind of retaliation for this. And at some point, Kirsten and her friend Arthur get separated from the symphony. I won't explain how. And they are all on their way trying to get to this place, to this airport that they know about in a place called Severed City. And they believe that there is a sort of a civilization that's growing up there. It's said to have a museum. And so we're following that storyline. And then in between those chapters, we also learn more about Arthur, how Arthur became an actor, and then how his different wives. And there is one of his wives, the first wife, is a woman who is sort of an amateur artist. She's drawn a comic. She's done all of these arts, and she's made this comic called Dr. 11. And Dr. 11 is the main character, and Dr. 11 lives on a sort of Elysium type planet, I guess you could say, because there had been a pandemic in the world, and there were a bunch of people who escaped onto this sort of planet, and then there was like a war on the planet. So there's a parallel story also somewhat of this Dr. 11. And as it turns out, Kirsten has two volumes of this Dr. 11 comic that she had received from Arthur. And there are just all these interconnections. And wow, I'm just not doing it any justice. And I hope I'm not giving spoilers. I don't think I am. Because I'm not telling you anything that happens to anybody, but it's very rich. It's very well done. And Mandel moves seamlessly back and forth between the current time, which would be the 20 years ahead, or the future time, I guess, and then looking back at what is, our normal world, and people talking about what they remember. And like Kirsten, who was only 8 years old and lost her parents immediately. And then we find out that she wandered for a while, but we don't know what happened to her. She eventually found her brother, and then they endured things that she refuses to speak about. She never talks about it. Um, but she can remember flashes of things. Like she can remember water running out of it, warm water running out of a tap. She can remember that you used to be able to flip a switch and a lights would come on in a room. She can remember that you could look at a device or a screen and that it would give you information. But she really does not have like a visceral memory of it, like where some of the older people, they're constantly trying to, if they think they can, they think they could maybe get the internet back, or and they'll talk about, wow, when we had information at our fingertips, or these kinds of things. So it's just it's such an it's so hard to explain. It's so well done. And her prose style is just smooth and lovely. I think that the word lyrical is overused. And honestly, I don't know that I would call her prose lyrical. I would call it just thoughtful. And she doesn't waste words. And she's also not overly literary. This book is very well paced. It has a definite plot, and it moves at just such an even and wonderful click. Uh, Perfect cliffhangers, wonderful suspense. I don't know. I can't say enough good things about it. I mean, I've been talking about it for 20 minutes almost here, so what else can I say? If you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. And I plan to read everything she's written. I've read the Lola Quartet, and now I've read Station 11. I'd like to go back and read her two earlier novels. I think it was Last Night in Montreal, and then I can't remember the other one. I can't remember the name of the other one. And at that time, in one of the interviews I read, she said she was more focused on trying to write sort of literary crime fiction. And now she's been sort of more interested in, sort of this fantasy, literary fantasy. But, to her credit, she is one of those writers who says, I don't want a label. I don't think that we should be, making these buckets, and it should just be, the story is the story. It has elements of everything, and the writing should be good, should be strong. Uh, so yeah, Station 11. Yeah, loving it, loving it. I wish that I really wanted to reread it, but for the channel's sake, I moved ahead, I forged ahead, and I picked up in Ascension by Martin MacInnes, which I was buddy reading, or going to buddy read with Ed Cook, subscriber. And I think that we have decided, that Ed has decided he's not going to read this, because he actually just read one of MacInnes's other books and didn't get on with it at all. And I also was honest with him and said, this was hard going for me in the first half of the book has been not great. I have a lot of flags. I finally got some flags. And I have a lot of flags, and I have to say that a lot of the flags say, what? Huh? Or, ugh. Because yes, I flag my what and ugh moments. Only because it's a bit uneven to me. There's a lot of info dumping. There's a lot of science, and I mean, I couldn't tell you if the science is correct or if he's making it up, but there's a lot of it, and it does come across in a very info dumpy way, and also in a way where it's more confusing than enlightening, because it sort of is the type of that sort of shuts you out And then, yeah. And then I have some ughs because when he tries to get really literary and really profound, it just it doesn't go so well. I now where I am now, I'm about a little more than halfway through, and it has started to move along at quite a nice clip. I have found that when he is writing and he has the protagonist whose name is Lee in situations where she's doing things and she's active and she's working with other characters, everything and they're focused on a mission, his prose gets better and tighter, and the book moves along at an interesting clip. Um, I know this has been a book that a lot of people really, really love. I have to say the protagonist is a little flat. Lee is the main character. She's a marine biologist, and she gets pulled into this mission because she has an expertise with algae. And there's a mission where it's a secret mission. They want to go into space, and she is going to be providing the algae that they will use as sustenance, but also as sort of a not a mood enhancer, but to give the people on the ship something green and something natural to look at and spend time with. And it's told in the first person, and she's just not the most compelling narrator ever. There's a lot of the story where it focuses on her childhood, and honestly, to me, at least right now, being only halfway through, I'm not entirely sure why we have to have this sort of tragic childhood angle. It doesn't really lend any interest to the book, and in fact, it makes it kind of lends just a bit of melodrama, in my opinion. But maybe it will have some meaning at the end. I'm just normally not somebody who has the patience for books where, oh, but it all comes together in the last 30 pages. I don't care. Don't waste my time for the first 330 pages or whatever. Um, and I felt like that a little bit, but it's had enough sections where she gets busy doing her work and doing something and focused, and those sections have kept me turning the pages. So I'll keep going as long as it's moving at this pace. But if it does start to get a little melodramatic and woo woo, I may end up DNFing it. So we'll see how that goes. I don't know. And then I have a nonfiction book going because I've decided that I want to try to have always a fiction and a nonfiction book going because I have a lot of nonfiction and I don't get to read enough of it. I tend to just kind of plow through novels. But I picked up Avid Reader by Robert Gottlieb, who is the famous literary editor who edited Catch 22 and Chaim Potok's The Chosen, his first novel, and I think all of his or many of his books thereafter. Not to mention so many other wonderful books. True Grit was one of his books. He did the Robert Caro books. Toni Morrison, he was Toni Morrison's editor. I'm blanking now, but I think I'm about 25% of the way through that and really enjoying it. It's told in a very kind of casual, sitting across the table from each other and having a cup of coffee or a drink kind of way. And, here's my experience. And yes, I knew them and it was like this in those days. And so if you're interested in publishing, if you're interested in literature, if you are interested in how editors work and what that process is like, and the wonderful thing so far about Gottlieb is that he really has not a mean word to say about anybody, and he's not really here to like spill blood. So that's a nice thing, at least not at least not in the first 25% of the book. So it's pretty enjoyable, but he's got an impressive roster of clients. So uh, an amazing life. He had a really, of course, he passed away recently, just a few weeks ago. But what a thing to be reading. So I'm going to continue on with that, and I'll talk more about that when I'm finished with it. And yeah, I think that that's everything. Yeah, let me know what you're reading, if you are enjoying it, or what you've got coming up, and or if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were. And I will just look forward to hearing from you in the comments, and or on another video maybe. But thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope that you have a good rest of your day. Okay, take care. Bye.